are listening to Lady-ish, where wellness gets unfiltered. This is the podcast where real talk meets whole self-transformation. I am your host, Autumn Noble O'Hanlon. I'm a coach, healer, author, and wellness guide, and I have created this unfiltered space for women who want more out of life, but on their own terms. Every week, we will dive into the messy, beautiful, and often contradictory layers of wellness, covering everything from career shifts and body image to energy healing, intuitive living, fitness, burnout recovery, and creating change that actually sticks. Whether you're chasing a new chapter, healing old wounds, or just trying to reconnect with yourself in a loud, overwhelming world, Lady-ish is here to support your evolution. You can expect honest conversations, coaching wisdom, holistic tools, spiritual insights, and permission to be a little bit of everything and nothing that you're not. Because wellness isn't one size fits all, and neither are you. Welcome back to the podcast, my friends. Today's topic is kind of how I think about my coaching in general. And it is that space where neuroscience, mindfulness, identity work, and personal transformation all kind of come together. I like to think that that is where my coaching really lives. And specifically, this whole month, we're talking a lot about meditation and neuroplasticity and the real science behind how we wire our brain and ultimately how that reshapes our identity, our life, our entire reality. Today, we're talking about meditation and neuroplasticity, and we're going to be spending all month focusing on meditation, in fact. And today, I'm going to dig a little bit more into the very real science behind rewiring your brain and ultimately how that can reshape your whole reality, your life, your identity, your work, but every part of your reality is impacted by how our brain operates and how our brain is wired. Here's what we know today about the brain that we're going to unpack a little bit more. Your brain is not fixed. It's always evolving and changing. This means that your personality is not permanent. And your patterns that you have and all those habits that we have, they're not our destiny. What's more, the identity that you rehearse every day is what ultimately becomes the life that you continue to create. And I really want you to hear me when I say that the identity that you're rehearsing every day, it's those patterns like lines in a play that we're just rehearsing day in and day out, those patterns that we run every single day. That's ultimately what becomes the life that we continue to create. And we're going to talk today about how you can change some of that if you're not currently living the life that you actually want. So we're exploring today, what is neuroplasticity? We're going to talk very simply about it. How does meditation physically change your brain? Why your thoughts become automatic patterns? How our identity kind of filters our reality? And ultimately, how mindfulness helps you interrupt those unconscious programming and patterns and consciously create a new internal world, a new identity that will eventually flow into a new reality. So settle in, take a breath. This is going to be a big one to kick off the month. As I mentioned, this month we're digging really deeply into meditation and neuroscience and identity. In the premium side of my podcast, that private space, Becoming Her, I'm rolling out a 21-day meditation challenge. So if you have ever thought, this is the time I want to explore meditation, you can join that for $5 and get access to all the other content over there, including all of my exclusive coaching programs. My two primary programs are now released in full on the Becoming Her side of the podcast. So you get the 21-day guided meditation challenge, as well as all the other content, $5 a month. You can quit at any time. Get out there, get started meditating, and watch how your brain and your life can change. I'm going to tell you more about that now. We have to start any of these conversations about meditation and mindfulness in your brain around the concept of neuroplasticity and just sort of set the stage here. Would it surprise you to know that for most of modern history, scientists actually believed that our brain was relatively fixed after adulthood? But now we know through neuroscience that is far from the case. And in fact, neuroscience has told us something pretty dramatically different. And what neuroscience has found is that our brain is constantly changing. And this ability of our brain to constantly change and evolve is called neuroplasticity. And that is the brain's capacity to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout our life. When I talk about neural connections, I want you to think about it this way. Every repeated thought, every repeated reaction, behavior, or belief strengthens certain neural pathways in your brain. Simply said, what that means is that neurons that fire together wire together. The more you think a thought, the easier that thought becomes to think again because the neurons are starting to fire and wire together. The more you practice anxiety, self doubt, resentment, overworking, people pleasing, or even just fear, the more efficient your brain is becoming at producing those states automatically. Your brain is designed to be efficient. And so once it's done something a handful of times, it's like, I know this one, I know this dance move, it's going in the background. And when similar situations arise, it just keeps running those patterns, those thoughts. But the opposite is also true. I always say everything in life is yin and yang. And so often we kind of forget the other side. The other side of this coin is that the more you practice presence, self awareness, gratitude, emotional regulation, compassion, calm, or intentional thinking, the stronger those neural pathways and networks become as well. And so if we spend so much time focusing on these negative thoughts, like I'm not good enough, and it becomes kind of a pattern and a belief and kind of forms this idea of who we are. Imagine what we could do if we spent that same energy thinking, I'm good enough. I can figure it out. I deserve this. And how that would change our energy and how we're showing up. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But here's why I'm talking about this today in this month of meditation, because meditation interrupts unconscious repetition and it gives the brain a new experience. And through those new experiences, we create new wiring. Meditation, I think, in its simplest terms, is almost like if we were to silence the entire surrounding world and give a microphone to our brain and actually watch and listen to what the brain is saying. That's kind of like what meditation does. Throughout our day, we have all these automatic thoughts and patterns happening in the background. And a lot of times it's negative thoughts. My boss is a jerk. I hate this job. I'm never good enough. I can't do that anymore. I'll never figure that out. This is just the way that it is. All of those thoughts kind of run in the background and we don't really pay attention. We kind of just let them be true or we kind of let them fly by. When we meditate, we're actually asking ourselves to observe those thoughts. And it interrupts kind of the unconscious elevator music that we're carrying around. Instead, we start to, or we're invited to recognize, man, I think that a lot, or gosh, I think that a lot, or oh, I had no idea I was carrying that thought around. I wonder where that comes from. But meditation really invites us to start paying more attention to what those unconscious patterns are. And the more we do that and pay attention, we're really kind of interrupting the automation of those sort of crappy thoughts. And meditation is so much more than a spiritual philosophy or like a coaching tool. It's so much more than that because studies are starting to show us that there's measurable structural and functional changes in your brain when you meditate, right? So it's almost like I like to think about our brain in the same way we think about our muscles. And I'm a personal trainer and I kind of integrate training and coaching into kind of my holistic approach to well being in general. You have to tend to your body. Your brain is just another one of those parts of our body that we have to expose to new things, like stretch it and challenge it to grow so that we can strengthen it in ways that we want, right? In the same way that we lift weights or we move. We want to strengthen muscles in that direction. We don't want to strengthen the muscles that allow our body to sit on the couch all day long. And I think a lot of us, day to day, that's kind of what we're strengthening our brain to do is sort of relax, kind of kick back and not pay attention and be present in what's happening. And meditation sort of says, brain, let's get off the couch and like, let's do something better here. And the studies are showing us that it's actually building better structures within the brain. It's almost if it were building new muscle when you're kind of lifting weights at the gym. Research from Harvard affiliated neuroscientists find that mindfulness meditation was associated with additional or increased gray matter density in parts of your brain associated with learning and memory, emotional regulation, empathy, and self awareness. Researchers also observed that meditation resulted in decreased density in our amygdala brain. That's the part of our brain that's associated with that fear and stress response. So, stated really simply, if you're sick of being stressed out all the time and you feel like you can't remember anything anymore, you're having a hard time being aware, regulating your emotions, the simple fix for that is practice meditation. It's actually going to grow that part of your brain responsible for all those things that we want. And it's going to diminish or decrease the density of that part of our brain that's creating the results that we don't want: fear, anxiety, and stress. In fact, they did a study on participants in an 8-week meditation program. And what they found was that program produced observable changes in the brain of those participants. And those participants were meditating for about 30 minutes a day. And I get it, that's a lot. But there are other studies out there also telling us that it doesn't take that long to start creating measurable change in parts of your brain. So if you're starting out at 6 minutes a day, studies have found that that little bit of a change can start producing real results in your brain. It biologically reshapes the architecture of your brain, which is, I don't know what more we could possibly want. If you think about the way our brains operate today with all the stimulation that we have, there's this new term that I keep hearing called popcorn brain, where it's sort of like, oh, squirrel, we're just constantly distracted by all of the little things, kind of popping from thing to thing and task switching all day long. And it's creating changes in our brain, which for me tells us even more that these practices of mindfulness and meditation to kind of retain the important parts of our brain, memory, attention, and learning, is becoming more and more important as technology and social media erode many parts of those brains because we're constantly distracted, task switching, and then you add the stress of modern day life to it, which also can erode those parts of our brain associated with memory and logic and reasoning. And so I just think there's a lot happening in our world today that really drives to the need to start working on these practices and making them part of our daily life in order to prevent further erosion of the important parts of our brain. I love this especially because as a coach, one of the most frustrating statements that I hear from people, and listen, we all do this, but often working with new people, I hear them say these sort of black and white statements about who they are. This is just who I am. I've never been able to do that. I've always been this way. This is just the way it's always been done. I've always reacted that way. We've always had that kind of a relationship. I'm just not a disciplined person and I can't change. I've tried everything. Neuroscience tells us otherwise. Not only are those all not factual, they're just sentences and stories and opinions that we sort of create about ourselves over our lifetime, that we've thought again and again and again, and now we just treat them as like a fact. Those sort of suggest that how our brain has historically operated, it can't be changed. And neuroscience tells us that that's simply not the case. And so if your brain has historically not done well with a certain type of exercise, that doesn't mean that that is just the way that you are and it can't be changed. And I think that's really important for people to hear, that if that's the story you're telling about yourself, not only is not that not likely factually accurate, it's just your opinion about yourself, but neuroscience tells us that that is not true. If you decided to change all those things about yourself, you could rewire your brain to become more disciplined or less anxious or to show up differently in those relationships because your brain adapts to what you practice repeatedly. We're going to unpack more about what that means here in a minute. I've said a number of times on a number of episodes that, our brain is really designed to seek pleasure, avoid pain, and maintain consistency. And that's truly what it is. Your brain is designed to survive and be efficient. So once something becomes familiar, the brain automates it. And that's why you can leave work and drive home without even remembering how you did it and without even being present during all those turns and maneuvers. Your brain has seen that pattern enough times. It's like, okay, background. We're just going to relegate it and be efficient. We don't want to spend brain energy on that because we know it well enough. Your brain also does that with emotional triggers that sort of happen instantly. Repeat relationship patterns that we go through again and again unconsciously, but also those old stories that we repeat automatically and we replay automatically, kind of like all those statements I was just saying early about old experiences that we have sort of decided, well, this is who I am. I've never been that way. I can't be another way. It's just replaying old stories automatically. That part of your subconscious mind is always just running learned programs. And meditation can help you become more aware of those programs instead of being controlled by them, because that kind of mindfulness, it creates a space between the stimulus and the response. It sort of allows yourself to take a breath and say, okay, I'm observing this in my life. How do I want to respond? Instead of feeling so disconnected from the stimulus and the response. So instead of a trigger resulting in an automatic reaction, we start creating a trigger awareness and a conscious choice. Then that pause is really what's powerful, because that pause is what allows us, just from a nervous system perspective, to kind of observe the pull of the pattern and choose more consciously and intentionally how we want to show up. Maybe you want to live the pattern again. That's fine. That's your choice. But at least we're making space to make that choice intentionally. That pause is so powerful. And I think the pause is really what we're working towards. It's not necessarily the change that comes after, it's the pause. Because any kind of transformation, it's not going to happen when your life is just continually triggering you. Transformation is only going to happen when your awareness becomes stronger than your conditioning. And that awareness is what happens in that pause. So again, I don't have any opinion really on how anyone should be living their life. The only thing I advocate for is to live with more intention. What you choose to do with that intention is entirely up to you. But that pause allows us to actually make a choice. Do I want to continue this pattern? Do I want to create a new pattern? And I think that's a beautiful thing. One of the most fascinating areas of meditation research that I found involves something called default mode network, or DMN. I'm absolutely going to butcher that at some point. DMN is a network in the brain that's associated with self-referential thinking. So how we think about ourselves. Rumination, those thoughts that just go around and around and around. Our mind wandering, where does it go? Replaying the past, imagining and planning for that future, and constructing your sense of self. So all of that taken together tells us that the DMN network is essentially our internal narrator, or person within us that's always telling the story of me, how we describe ourselves, our tendencies, our habits, where our mind goes when it wanders. It's that part of us that's always narrating our own story. Research has told us that meditation changes activity and connectivity in that particular network. And that's important because a lot of people mistake their internal narrative or their narrator as objective truth. I kind of mentioned that earlier. I'm not good at that. I've never been good at that. And we treat it as if it were factual and true and the only way the world could possibly operate. And that's us seeing that internal narrator and seeing what it's saying and saying, well, that's just the way that it is. It's objectively true. But often that's not the case. It's just repeated conditioning. Some examples of that repeated conditioning that are very common in all humans: I'm behind, I'm not enough, People always leave. Success is hard. I have to earn more in order to rest. I'm too much. I'm not ready. And because those thoughts are repeated really frequently for a lot of us, the brain strengthens those neural pathways. And eventually it stops feeling like thoughts that we're choosing. It starts to feel like an identity, like cold, hard truth about who we are as a person. I think back to some of the identities that I've sort of identified for myself over the years that I recognized and kind of shed. And one of them had to do with this characterization of me as kind of being this bitch who would just like be really outspoken and argue with anybody about this, that, and the other in politics. And I don't know where it came from. And actually, now that I say that, I have a pretty good idea where it came from. I think being the only girl in a house full of men on a farm, I was kind of snippy. And I think when I was a teenager, I know when I was a teenager, I was kind of a little snob and was always kind of making snippy and snide comments. And so I think I kind of got characterized that way early on and it just stuck. And I think I've always kind of thought of myself as like someone who's like very assertive and like, likes to put people in their place. And because that's just what I had been told about who I was. And so it kind of became this idea around my identity. Like I just believed that I was that way. Everyone told me I was that way. And I kept telling myself, well, this is just who I am. And the reality of it is that I am not that way at all. If I'm having words with somebody, they have been pushing me for a very, 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 very long time. It takes a lot for me to kind of come out and be a bitch to somebody. But for the longest time, I think starting at a very young age, I was kind of characterized as the outspoken one. And I think even to this day, my parents kind of make this joke about, well, Autumn will tell them. I'm like, I won't though. Like, I mean, maybe you felt that from me as my parents as a kid, but I've never been that way. And I'm not that way now. And it's just interesting how their characterization of me kind of formed my identity and idea of who I was, but it also kind of formed their idea about who I am. And so when I don't show up in that way, it causes a little bit about who we are and how we are. And oftentimes we adopt them without even considering, like, is that accurate? Is that really who I am? Or is that just something that someone said so many times that I sort of adopted as true? And then eventually it became an identity. Because this is, what I'm telling you is ultimately where neuroscience and personal development kind of collide in the way they did for me. The stories that people tell us about who we are can become neural pathways and beliefs about ourselves and form our own self concept about who we are and how we interact with the world, right or wrong. From there, it's really important to recognize that your identity will then determine what your brain notices, expects, and reinforces. Okay. Your brain is constantly filtering reality around you through your beliefs. So if you believe that you are a certain kind of a way, or you're not good at certain things, you're not able to do certain things, your brain is going to scan your world for proof of those beliefs. Your brain is not designed to argue with you. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias. So we unconsciously seek evidence that confirms what you believe to be true about yourself. So for me, my brain was always looking for instances where maybe I was a little too bitchy or maybe I was too aggressive and I'd like feel bad about it. And I kind of ended up swinging in the other direction and being much more of a people pleaser because I had this like fear and this identity around being too outspoken or being too aggressive. And I really didn't want to be that way. And so I kind of went the other direction because my brain was scanning my environment and looking for evidence to support this conclusion that I was kind of a bitch and I was too outspoken and I like to argue with people. And that drove me to kind of go the other way. So, similarly, some examples. If someone identifies as overwhelmed, unlucky, rejected, invisible, burned out, unworthy, or incapable, their brain will scan their reality for proof of that. And it's going to find data to back it up. Not because it's universally true, but because your brain is prioritizing what's familiar and it's trying to confirm what you've already told it to be true. Like you're showing up in the world saying like, I'm not good at this. And your brain's like, you know what? Yeah, like you kind of messed this up and you kind of messed that up. And that one time it went really bad. You were worse than everybody else because you've decided, you've made this conclusion, and your brain is not going to argue with it. It's just going to sift all the data around you to find support. This is also why change can feel so uncomfortable. Because if you want to start thinking about yourself as someone who's maybe not aggressive and maybe someone who is a little bit more of a mediator, more conciliatory, that new identity can feel very unsafe to your nervous system because it's kind of unfamiliar. It's like, I don't know what to do with this. This isn't consistent with what the directions you've been telling me to sift your reality through. Meditation can help bridge that. Meditation can help with this because it helps to regulate our nervous system enough so that it can tolerate becoming someone new. So what meditation does is it teaches us to pay attention to what's coming up, to what we're experiencing, what we're feeling, what our brain is saying, so that we can teach our nervous system, like, this is not a problem. This is not something to be reacted to. We can keep ourselves from reacting automatically because we're plugged in and we're paying attention and we're learning to calm and be aware and soothe ourselves when that discomfort comes up, because we learn through meditation how to pay attention to it. And so when you're trying to shift your identity and the way that people think about yourself or the way that you think about yourself, that discomfort, it can cause a lot of emotion and energy and thoughts. And using meditation, we can monitor that, pay attention to it, and not let that discomfort, fear, and all those crazy thoughts push us back into old patterns. This is going to be a little inconsistent from what a lot of people think meditation is. Most people think that meditation is we're clearing our mind, we're like wiping off the whiteboard, and there's not going to be anything left. But often meditation is actually more about observing your mind without automatically becoming it. We become the watcher of our thoughts, not the person that's controlled by them. In that space, we begin witnessing habitual fears, repetitive stories, emotional loops, unconscious assumptions about ourselves and others, and inherited beliefs. And slowly, over time, you start to realize I can observe all of those thoughts without identifying with it. I can observe all of those feelings of fear, all those worried thoughts. I don't have to identify with them. I don't have to chase them. I don't have to let them spur me into action. And that ability to realize that can be really profound, because in that space, it's kind of that pause. Like, I'm not acting, I'm just pausing and watching what's coming up. This thought keeps coming up. I don't have to agree with it. I don't have to follow it. And that's really a powerful space, because once you stop identifying with every single thought, you create that possibility for intentional shifting and intentional identity creation and new neural pathway creation. So, for instance, if your neural pathway and habit and identity is, I'm just an anxious person, and I hear that a lot, you can instead begin noticing, I'm experiencing anxiety right now, and just watch it and witness it, and just see what comes up and see if you can understand the thoughts that follow or that drive it, and noticing the sensations in your body. And we allow all that to move through us in that simple observation, instead of sort of becoming prey to it and letting it kind of dictate how we live. Similarly, instead of thinking, I'm broken or I'm not good enough, you notice, I have a lot of survival patterns that don't serve me. I have a lot of self-doubt that keeps coming up and isn't helping me be the person that I want to be. And that's the notice. That's the observation in a meditative space that you can access. You kind of witness all of this coming up, and we sort of name it and just identify it and work to have empathy for ourselves for even having some of these old patterns and thoughts. That awareness alone loosens the grip of all of those years of conditioning that built those neural pathways. Here's something really important, because I know that whenever we talk about shifting identities or rewiring neural pathways, it sounds like a very complicated thing that we're doing. And anything worth doing is worth doing not very well to begin with and not very big to begin with. It's about really small steps. Whenever I meet with my coach and I'm telling her all the things I want to do, one of the first things or one of the certain things that's going to come out of her mouth is, how can we make this smaller? How can we cut this in half and still feel like we're making progress? And I think that's a good way of thinking about meditation too. Because while one meditation session can certainly help you feel calmer, neuroplasticity depends on consistency and practice, just like lifting weights. You can't lift weights once and see your body change. And we have to think of our brain the same way. We can't just meditate once and hope for change. We have to engage in smaller daily practices. Doing that creates long-term changes, more so than occasional, really intense efforts. So even just a few minutes a day can strengthen new neural pathways associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. And that's becoming the observer of what's happening inside of your brain and your body. That is why meditation is so much less about perfection and wiping the slate clean. And it's really more about returning to yourself. And what I mean by that is you watch the thoughts come up, you watch the emotions come up, and we bring it back to ourselves, to the observer of those thoughts and of those emotions. Because every time you bring that awareness back to your breath, or observe a thought without reacting, or you choose compassion for yourself instead of criticizing yourself. Why do I keep thinking that? Why does that keep coming up? Every time you choose compassion over that criticism, or every time you interrupt the old narrative, or regulate yourself instead of spiraling and letting the anxiety take you. Every time you do that, you're practicing a new neural pathway. You're teaching your brain, now we do this. This is our new pattern. This is our new habit. And that is where real meaningful change can happen. This is so important, I think, for every human being, not just people that are wanting to create big changes in their life, but for every human being, because your nervous system dictates how you experience your reality, period. When your body lives in chronic stress, survival becomes the lens through which your entire life is interpreted. A dysregulated, high stress nervous system tends to perceive threat, scarcity, rejection, urgency, danger, and lack, right? It sees everything in life through that lens of threat and fear. And so that confirmation bias sort of sees every, maybe that harsh comment as a challenge, as a threat, like that look, someone's definitely mad at me. I'm definitely getting fired, right? Everything in your life, that confirmation bias is going to interpret in a threatened space, right? Through that lens of survival. But when we can leverage meditation to regulate our nervous system better, your perception will change. You'll become less reactive, more present, more emotionally resilient, and more intentional, right? It's that pause and deciding, how do I want to show up here? What do I want to do here? How do I want to move forward? How do I want to feel in this moment? And why do I feel the way that I feel? And because of that, when your internal state changes, your external choices start to change too. And that's the part that I think people really miss. Meditation doesn't magically change your life overnight. It changes you, it changes your brain, and you begin making different decisions from a different state of consciousness, from a part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex that's responsible for decision making and rational thinking, from a stronger prefrontal cortex and a less strong amygdala, fear-based brain. It changes your brain and you will make different decisions. That is how meditation can truly change your life. You're operating from a different level of consciousness. So I want to offer you some practical ways to kind of start rewiring your mind a little bit. So these are simple practices that support neuroplasticity and identity transformation. 1, observe your automatic thoughts. Not every thought deserves belief, which is a lot of energy attached to the thought. You thought it so many times that you think is like a rule of your life. So start noticing repetitive narratives without immediately attaching to them, and just pay attention to what those thoughts are, what your elevator music is day in and day out. 2, practice present moment awareness. Presence interrupts mental loops. So even really brief pauses matter. One of the first things I started doing when I was implementing this work is when I was feeling very stressed at work, I would take a moment and just say, like, what is going through my brain right now? And it was a lot of really helpless, victim laden garbage. Like, this is never going to work. I can't figure this out. I don't want to do this anymore. Why do they do that to me? Like, no one's here to help me. Like, I'm drowning here. All of those thoughts were so gross. And even saying them out loud, I'm still embarrassed. But that small present moment awareness really helped me see, like, I'm marinating my brain in some pretty crappy beliefs. And I need to start shifting away from those because they're not helping me figure out the situation right now. They're just making me feel terrible. So small mindful pauses to see what's happening up there. 3, pair meditation with identity statements. After meditation, your brain is often a little bit more receptive. So that's a really good space to try reinforcing some new identities, like, I'm becoming someone who trusts herself to follow through on her goals. I am safe to rest and relax. I can create new patterns in my life. I can create new skills and habits. Peace and rest is available to me instead of anxiety. So practice those mantras after you're done meditating, and maybe even bring them with you throughout the day on a post-it note, just to remind yourself that that space is always available to you. Kind of plug back into that higher knowing that's working to rewire your brain. 4, repetition over intensity. 5 consistent minutes daily is more powerful than 1 hour each month. Really want you to hear me when I say this. A lot of the people that I work with, we're perfectionists, we're overachievers. I want you to make this really, really small. And trust me when I tell you that that's all it takes to change your brain. And if that's what we're looking for, 5 minutes a day. Let's go. 5, regulate before you reinforce. Affirmations alone rarely work if the nervous system feels unsafe. This is, like, in a nutshell, my issue with the coaching industry. We can't just teach people to think differently. We have to teach people to regulate their nervous systems and their bodies and care for themselves holistically. And so I really think meditation is a critical piece of this because it helps create internal safety that's needed for change to stick. And so just being aware that you can give yourself positive mantras and affirmations all day, every day. But if your nervous system is constantly flooded with cortisol and you're living in fight or flight, it's not going to work. You need that nervous system regulation of meditation to connect the dots and allow that other work to really stick. Last, if you're looking for a very easy way to implement some nervous system and meditation work this month, check out my private space. I'm leading a 21-day guided meditation challenge. It's $5 a month. The link is in the show notes. All right, my friends, in closing, I want to really stress that your brain is listening to what you repeatedly practice. So we should probably start paying better attention to the crappy things that we're telling ourselves in our heads. And that's what meditation can help you do. Furthermore, your nervous system is learning from what you repeatedly experience and create with your thinking and your emotions. And your identity is being shaped by the stories that you consistently rehearse, no matter how strongly you believe them to be true. They're usually stories, and we repeat them every day. And it shapes who we think we are and what we think we're capable of. Meditation invites you to become conscious of all of that, not to judge yourself, not to become perfect, but to participate intentionally in your own becoming and evolution, because you're not trapped inside your current patterns and ideas about who you are. Those are old, outdated understandings of our brain. Our brains can change. Your nervous system, it can heal. And these identities that we've carried with us, consciously or unconsciously, they can evolve. And sometimes transformation begins with something as simple as sitting still long enough to notice the stories that you've been living inside of yourself. If I had to choose for all of you, meditation or coaching, and you could only pick one, meditation every time. You have to calm your nervous system for any type of meaningful change to take root. All right, my friends, thank you so much for being here today. As I said, once again, 21-day meditation challenge. Link is in the show notes. You have nothing to lose. I promise you, your brains are going to be so much happier at the end of this month. I really, truly believe in this work, and I hope that many of you will sign up and get started on your own brain transformation journey this month. We are going to continue on this theme of brain science and identity shifts throughout the rest of the month. At the same time, I'm going to be dropping some guided meditations here on the free side of the podcast as well. So you won't be missing out on any of the meditation fun, but it'll be a little bit more intermittent on this side of things. If you want the daily guided meditations, they're all on the premium side. Coming up, we're going to be exploring the science of manifestation, some new moon meditations, as well as burnout and the impact that it has on your brain. So you might want to come back to this episode after you listen to the burnout episode, because you are going to be shocked when you hear how the chemicals of stress and burnout actually change your brain. And then you can come back here and learn how to fix it and how to rebuild those pathways that are eroding from burnout and stress. All right, my friends, I look forward to seeing you again. As always, thanks for listening and thanks for sharing with your friends who could also benefit from this information. We will see you next week.